Thank you very much for joining me today. In this session, we are going to talk about best practices in choosing an ALM tool. I am Frank Heise, Head of Quality Services at PTA Consulting. If you have any questions during or after this session, please use the chat window for this session. I would like to introduce PTA very briefly. PTA is an IT consulting company and development partner in various industries. We offer expertise and experience gathered in over 50 years of successful work in organizational and IT projects. That means PTA is even a little bit older than I am. At the moment, around 400 employees at 11 locations in Germany and one in Switzerland are working for PTA Consulting. Then, very important, we are independent of both manufacturers and financial markets, and we are a consulting partner for Inflectra in Germany since 2009. Again, feel free to send your questions through the chat window for this session. I would like to start by explaining what the motivation for this presentation is and what the objectives of the presentation are. I will start with the success factors that we consider to be the most important based on our practical experience. Then, I will go into the process of selecting an ALM tool, and I will end this presentation with two different summaries. The first are the most important selling points from our point of view, and on the other hand, with a summary of this presentation. So, first of all, the motivation and aims of the presentation. In this presentation, I will talk about our experiences with large German companies, especially the best practices in choosing an ALM tool. What I hope is exciting is that we were able to gain experiences on both sides of the negotiation table. That is why I present some of the more general experiences below. But partly, I will also present experiences which are either specially for companies, which have to select and implement an ALM tool, and partly experiences from the point of view of the tool provider. For the sake of simplicity, I will either use the term customer or provider in the following. On the respective slides, I will then also show the corresponding icon. Important to mention, on the customer side, we are not decision makers, but only enablers. That means we support the selection process. The decision itself is made by the customer. Now, let's go to the important success factors. On the one hand, the selection stands and falls with the stakeholders. The right stakeholders are needed. They need sufficient time for their activities and must be continuously integrated into the process. Secondly, a structured and transparent process is needed for the selection, which is communicated to all parties involved, including the provider. Thirdly, as in normal development projects, a structured analysis of requirements must be carried out, including a good documentation of these requirements. Then, very importantly, using an ALM tool only makes sense if the supported processes are lived and functioning. Fifthly, objective and measurable criteria are needed for the tool selection. Then, as in every IT project as well, the great quote, "It's all about communication" applies. And last but not least, the expectations of those involved must be managed. An ALM tool is not a silver bullet that solves all the problems. You might ask, isn't that self-evident? But our experiences show that on some of these points, the implementation in practice does not work out well. Now, let's look at the selection process itself. The process consists of 5 different phases. In the first phase, the processes, requirements, and so on are collected and documented. In the second phase, the pre-selection, 3 to 5 tools have to be identified. In the third phase, these tools have to be evaluated, and the most suitable tool must be selected. This selection is based on the defined requirements. Of course, this is far from being the end of the job. Before the final and fifth phase of introduction and training, we recommend to build a proof of concept. In this proof of concept, important functions of the selected ALM tool should be subjected to a practical test. It is unfortunately impossible to illuminate all phases within these 25 minutes. Only the introduction and the training are evening-filling topics. Therefore, I will focus on the first three phases in this presentation. First of all, let's have a closer look at the analysis of requirements. At the beginning of the selection process, a careful stakeholder analysis should be carried out. Best practices for this fill entire books and go beyond the scope of this presentation. But from our practical experience, the following stakeholders are important. First of all, the different departments that use the tool. Then, of course, the different process owners, like the incident manager, the release manager, and so on. Beside that, the different stakeholders from the IT are very important. These are typically the development manager, the test manager, the support, and IT administrators, and the different technical domain experts. For these stakeholders, it should always be considered whether and how they should be involved in this selection process. It must be taken into account that stakeholders are not only important for the determination of requirements. There's also the risk that stakeholders are not going to support the tool later on if they feel left out in the process of selecting the tool. Which are the objectives, benefits, and risks? The following should first be clarified. Which activities should be supported? Which processes should be supported with which priority? What measurable benefits should the tool have? And then, the risks should also be identified at a very early stage, and these risks have to be managed during the whole process. Typical risks are: do existing processes need to be changed? Is the selected tool maybe the wrong tool? And is resistance within the company to be expected? I, for example, have been working in the power industries for several years. There have been and still are many reorganizations, and the will and readiness of the employees for change is sometimes already very strained. This should be taken into account because the introduction of an ALM tool is a change for the users that should not be underestimated. At the beginning of the analysis of the requirements, the first question is: which processes should be supported by the ALM tool? The next step is to check whether these processes are currently lived uniformly in the company and, very important, whether they are documented. We strongly recommend the use of KO criteria. This means that if at least one of these criteria is not fulfilled, the corresponding tool is not suitable. From our practical experience, an average of 200 requirements emerges from this analysis. In order to structure these requirements, the requirements should be categorized. I will give an example of that on the next slide. We also recommend the use of checklists, which are very valuable because they help to think about all important functional, technical, and commercial criteria. As already explained on the previous page, about 200 different requirements are usually determined for the selection. In order to structure, group, and compare these requirements, categories and subcategories should be determined. A proposal for this categorization is shown below. Obviously, the most important category is the functional requirements, which can be subdivided according to processes and core functions. In practice, it is often forgotten to determine the non-functional requirements as well, and even more important, to describe them in a quantifiable way. A classic example are requirements such as the performance should be good enough to support the user in his practical work. This is definitely not a quantifiable requirement. Another very important category is, of course, the provider and its product. Relevant here are aspects such as service quality and support, market position, the available documentation, and the question of security and compliance. Finally, the cost must of course be included in the evaluation. This must take into account both the on-off costs and the running costs. At this point, I would like to mention the licensing model in particular, based on practical experience, because some of the manufacturers have relatively complicated models where there is a risk of underestimating the license costs. In the next step, each of the requirements is given a weighting factor. In doing so, the categories and their subcategories allow you to adjust the influence of the respective categories on the overall result. For example, what significance should the costs have for the decision? This is very important from our experience because there are different interest groups involved in the process. The users want, of course, the best tool in terms of functional requirements. The IT support is very interested in the provider being reliable and having a good support. Finally, the purchasing department looks primarily at the costs. That is why you need a factor for the different requirements. The next phase is the preselection of the tool. First of all, a long list has to be created in which the interesting and questionable tools are listed. Typically, such a list is determined by an internet research. When creating the shortlist, the most important thing is, of course, how much time and budget is available. In addition to the internet research, the various providers can, of course, also be questioned. However, this is a rather complex procedure and takes a lot of time. From the long list, a short list of 3 to 5 tools must now be created. For this, selection criteria have to be defined, ideally also some criteria. The fulfillment of these criteria typically determined by an internet research. Depending on the time budget, additional measures can and should be applied. On the one hand, this is, for example, the questioning of the reference customers. In addition, a review of articles like test reports is also very useful. And now let's have a closer look at the selection itself. From the customer's point of view, a key factor are the stakeholders. Before the workshops, the stakeholders have to understand what is the selection process, what are the goals, what is the intended benefit, and which processes should be supported by the tool. And of course, the stakeholders must be given sufficient time to prepare for the workshop. Secondly, the process for the tool selection must be explained to the provider at a very early stage. An example. In one case, one of the inferior providers complained that certain things were not clear to him and that he felt unfairly treated. In this case, it could be clearly proven that the process, the time limits, and so on were clearly documented and communicated to him. The next step is to give the provider a clear agenda for the workshop. In this agenda must be defined which scenarios should be shown. From my practical experience, the moderator of the customer should have no inhibitions to intervene here if necessary during the workshops. We also made very good experiences with so-called wow factors. What does that mean? This means that in addition to the defined scenarios, the provider should present which functions of his tool are the most exciting for the customers from his point of view. In our view, this is also an excellent way to show whether the provider simply presents his standard portfolio or whether he has really understood the customer's specific needs. Finally, the workshops explicitly does not talk about economic aspects. Purchasing does this in own appointments. Let's now have a look at the workshop from the provider's perspective. I know that sounds a bit profane, but I'll mention it anyway. Good preparation is everything. As provider, you have to understand what are the requirements of the customer. Does the customer have defined processes or not? And how does your ALM tool support them? And finally, do not hesitate to clarify any questions in advance with the customer's contact persons. Our experience is that queries are perceived positively and not negatively by the customer. Then, very important, show the required scenarios live on the tool. Colleagues of mine, for example, had a workshop a few weeks ago in which they demonstrated the scenarios defined by the customer live. After the appointment, the contact person of the customer called and thanked effusively that the scenarios were shown. This means, of course, the other providers had not done this, or at least not well. Of course, these activities require a lot of preparation time. Then, for the workshops, you need clearly defined roles and tasks. We separate the following roles at least: a moderator and a tool expert who shows the functions of the tool. Here too, a practical tip: the moderator should dare to intervene actively so that the schedule is adhered to and all scenarios are shown. My experiences are that the customer clearly appreciates this. After the workshop, this must be carefully processed. That means a comprehensive protocol and a list of open questions has to be done. In addition, clear contact persons should be defined for the queries. After the workshops, the stakeholders have to make the ratings for the different tools. The logic for this is, I think, very simple. First of all, the different requirements have numeric factors like 1, 2, 3, and 4. If you want the high priority requirements to be included disproportionately in the rating, you can assign factors like 1, 2, 5, and 9 instead. The factor is then multiplied by the stakeholders' rating. This way, you get the results for the categories and for the subcategories as well. The aim of the process described above is to obtain an objective evaluation. How these results are best visualized is, of course, a matter of taste. In any case, I prefer bar charts. They are very helpful and provide a good overview of the overall results and represent well whether a tool has clearly won or whether it was a close decision. In addition, it is often very helpful to use supplementary diagrams to graphically display the ratings of the subcategories for a desired category. Here, for example, the category functional requirements is visualized with a network diagram. Now I would like to say a few words about the unique selling points, which are particularly important from our point of view as Inflectra partner. First of all, this is the traceability. Of course, other ALM tools also have this functionality, but in Spira, the visual implementation in the GUI is very well solved. Then, Spira offers an out-of-the-box integration of a variety of tools and open interfaces. Thirdly, Spira has very simple and transparent licensing models. I've seen offers from other providers where the different roles such as tester, test case creator, test manager, and so on cost very different license costs, which makes the calculation for the customer very difficult. Then, many customers appreciate the individually adaptable workflows. And finally, the price-performance ratio is considered very good compared to tools with similar functionality. I will conclude with a short summary. First of all, the summary from the customer's perspective. The selection and introduction of an ALM tool is each a project and should be handled in that way with requirement management, risk management, project and resource planning, and so on. Then, the selection process must be transparent to internal and external stakeholders right from the outset. We recommend a clear separation between purchasing and the rest of the team right from the start. And also very important, the expectations of a new tool must be clearly defined from the beginning and communicated to all parties involved and later to the users. And finally, even a good tool is not accepted by the departments without good introduction and training. And now the summary from the perspective of partners. First of all, if the customer has not defined and lived a test and QA process, the introduction of an ALM tool makes little sense. In the worst case, then the tool becomes the scapegoat. Then the success of the workshops and the evaluation by the customer depends largely on a customer-specific presentation. So as a partner, you should prove why Spira is the right product for this company. There must also be a clear management of expectations on the part of the provider. So communicate clearly what the tool can do and cannot do. Here again, my practical experience is quite clear that most companies appreciate clear communication if the tool does not meet a certain requirement. This is not seen as a weakness, but strengthens credibility. Defined contact persons must be named, for example, for technical questions about the tool and for commercial questions too. And finally, be binding and always react quickly. Here too, I have experienced cases in which the customer, to put it bluntly, had to run after the provider so that, for example, the open questions from the workshop were answered. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'd like to thank you all for your attention and interest. And again, feel free to send your questions through the chat window for this session.